For most of us, history tastes familiar: bread, meat, and a little wine on the side. But the real menu of the Dark Ages was far stranger, simpler, and often forgotten. Before modern kitchens, before spices came by sea, people ate what the land allowed, and sometimes what survival demanded. Tonight, we'll step back into that quiet, rugged world, into smoky huts, wooden bowls, and open hearths, to see what dinner really looked like when Europe was still finding its way out of the dark. If you enjoy calm, detailed stories from the past, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Boring History for Sleep, so you don't miss the next quiet journey into forgotten times. Now let's begin. In the centuries once called the Dark Ages, bread was more than food. It was survival. It filled the space where variety could not exist. It was the meal of the poor, the comfort of the traveler, the offering of the host, and sometimes the only thing that stood between hunger and death. For most people, a day without bread was a day without nourishment, a small disaster in a world already uncertain. Yet the bread of that time was not the light, golden loaf we imagine today. It was dense, heavy, and often dark, a product of hands that worked the earth, of fields that struggled under changing skies, and of grain that refused to grow easily. Every loaf told the story of the land and the labor that produced it. The process began long before sunrise. In small villages across Europe, women and men prepared their flour with a quiet rhythm that had changed little for centuries. There were no mechanical mills, no endless supplies of soft, white wheat. Instead, families grew what they could: barley, rye, oats, or spelt. Wheat, the finest of grains, was scarce and costly. It was the grain of monasteries and noble houses. For everyone else, darker grains became the base of life itself. Grinding the grain was the first and most exhausting step. In some villages, there were small watermills or windmills, but more often, it was done by hand using a quern. Two heavy stones, one placed atop the other. The lower one was fixed, while the upper one rotated as it was turned by hand or with the help of a wooden handle. Between them, the grain was crushed into coarse meal. The sound of the stones grinding was constant in peasant homes, a slow, scraping rhythm that spoke of effort and endurance. It took hours to produce enough flour for a single day. Dust coated everything: hands, clothes, faces, and filled the air like a pale fog. Children helped, taking turns pushing the handle or gathering what spilled. It was tiring, repetitive, and absolutely necessary. A family that could not grind could not eat. Once the meal was ready, it was sifted, though not always finely. The roughest flour went to the poorest, full of husks and grit. It made bread that was thick and uneven, but filling. Some families mixed their flour with crushed beans, peas, or chestnuts to stretch it further. Others used whatever grain they had left from the previous harvest. Nothing was wasted. The goal was not perfection, but sustenance. Water was added next, sometimes warm from the fire, sometimes cold from the well. The dough was mixed by hand in large wooden troughs or bowls. Salt, when available, gave flavor, though it was expensive in many regions. Yeast was not always understood as a living thing. Instead, people relied on pieces of old dough, saved from previous batches, or on the natural fermentation that came from leaving the mixture exposed to air. The result was unpredictable. Some loaves rose beautifully, others remained flat and dense. It depended on the warmth of the room, the quality of the flour, and a kind of quiet instinct that only years of practice could teach. Kneading was long and physical. The dough had to be worked until it lost its stickiness, until it felt elastic and alive beneath the hands. Women leaned their weight into it, folding and pressing again and again, their movements steady and unhurried. The sound of it, the soft slap of dough on wood, the creak of the table, filled kitchens across the countryside. When the dough was ready, it was left to rest beneath a cloth while the oven heated. Most homes did not have their own ovens. Building one required more fuel and space than a single family could afford. Instead, villages shared a communal bakehouse, a low stone building at the edge of the settlement. Each morning, families carried their shaped loaves there on wooden boards, marked with small cuts or symbols to tell them apart. The baker, often an older man or woman trusted by all, tended the fire and watched over the baking. The oven was heated first by burning wood until the stones glowed red. Then, the ashes were raked out, and the loaves were placed directly on the hot surface. The heat baked them from below, while the thick stone walls held warmth from all sides. The smell that filled the air was unmistakable, deep, earthy, and slightly sweet. It was the smell of nourishment, of relief. For people who lived by the rhythm of the land, that scent was as welcome as sunlight after rain. When the bread was done, it was darker than what we know today, often hard on the outside and moist inside. The crust was thick, sometimes almost black, but it kept the loaf fresh for days. It was sliced carefully, sparingly. In poor homes, bread was never cut wastefully. Every piece had purpose: to soak broth, to scoop stew, to carry butter or cheese. Even stale bread was saved, softened in water or milk, and eaten again. For those with little else, bread was the center of every meal. Morning began with it, a rough slice, sometimes dipped in ale or warm milk. Midday brought more, served with whatever vegetables or beans were available. At night, the same loaf returned to the table, perhaps toasted over the fire or crumbled into a simple soup. Its taste might not have been fine, but it filled the stomach, and that was enough. That in monasteries, bread was baked in great quantities. Monks saw it as both a necessity and a symbol of labor. Their loaves were made from the same grains as the peasants, but the process was organized, measured, almost scientific. In abbey bakehouses, rows of ovens burned day and night, the air thick with smoke and flour. Each loaf was part of a larger rhythm, made not for profit, but for community. Among the wealthy, bread showed status. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, was rare and prized. It was called manchet in some regions, soft, light, and pure in color. Only nobles and high clergy could afford it regularly. At banquets, this fine bread was not only eaten but used as a plate. Thick slices were laid beneath meat and sauces to absorb juices, then discarded or given to servants. In that simple act, class was revealed. What was waste to one was sustenance to another. The poorer families baked black bread, named not for its color but for its coarseness. It was heavy, dark with bran and rye, and strong enough to last a week. It was not luxurious, but it was reliable. In times of scarcity, people mixed bark, acorns, or roots into their flour to stretch it further. The taste was bitter, but hunger made it tolerable. Bread also played a quiet role in trade. Bakers and millers were central figures in every community. They kept account of debts, traded grain for labor, and sometimes even paid taxes in loaves. In villages far from markets, bread became a kind of currency, a measure of fairness and survival. Yet behind every loaf was a chain of work that began in the fields months before. The sowing, the harvest, the threshing, the grinding, all connected by hands and effort. When someone bit into bread, they consumed not only grain but the memory of labor itself. In that way, it carried a moral weight, a reminder that survival depended on patience and community. For travelers and soldiers, bread was life made portable. It could be dried, hardened, and carried for weeks. Hardtack, a simple, nearly inedible biscuit made only of flour and water, could last for months without spoiling. It was the food of marches, voyages, and sieges. To soften it, men soaked it in soup or ale. It was nourishment without comfort, endurance in edible form. Even in religion and ritual, bread found its place, not as a sacred symbol here, but as a measure of time and tradition. The baking of the first loaves after harvest marked a turning point in the year. Families gave thanks for the grain, not through ceremony, but through work, by making, by sharing, by eating together. To bake bread in the Dark Ages was to perform a task both ordinary and profound. It was a small act of control in a world ruled by uncertainty, weather, war, famine, and disease. To hold a loaf fresh from the oven was to hold warmth, effort, and continuity. In that simplicity lay comfort. The bread was imperfect, uneven, sometimes burnt or sour, but it was proof that life continued. Every loaf, no matter how rough, meant that someone had planted, harvested, ground, and baked. It was a quiet victory over hunger, repeated every single day. And as the sun set over small villages and smoke rose from the chimneys, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air once more, steady, grounding, familiar. It was the scent of resilience itself, the one thing that even the darkest age could never forget. In the world of the early Middle Ages, water was both essential and uncertain. It filled rivers, turned mills, and fed crops, but it was not always safe to drink. People lived close to the earth, yet even they knew that water, the very thing that gave life, could also bring sickness. Wells grew foul, rivers ran muddy, and stagnant pools carried disease long before anyone understood the word itself. And so, people turned to other ways to quench their thirst, ways that seem strange to us now, but were once as natural as breathing. In small villages, clean water was a luxury that had to be earned. Most communities drew their supply from wells, deep, hand-dug pits lined with stone. The water within was cool and clear at first, but as settlements grew, waste seeped into the ground. The same earth that gave food also absorbed refuse. A well too close to a latrine or to livestock could make an entire village ill. And because no one understood bacteria or contamination, the danger was invisible. People simply said the water had gone bad. To survive, they learned by experience. They knew which wells stayed sweet, which springs ran pure, and which to avoid after heavy rains. Some built small wooden covers over their wells to keep debris out. Others sent children early in the morning to draw water before the day's dust and traffic could disturb it. But even then, the taste was not always pleasant. Earthy, sometimes bitter, sometimes metallic. For that reason, most people rarely drank water by itself. Instead, they turned to safer, boiled, or fermented alternatives, liquids that had been transformed by heat or time into something cleaner, if not stronger. Among these, the most common was a weak, homebrewed drink made from grain, not the ale of taverns, but a light, nourishing beverage brewed for everyday use. It was low in strength, barely intoxicating, and often called small ale. In almost every village, families brewed it at home. The process began with barley or oats, soaked in water and left to sprout. Once the grain began to grow, it was dried and crushed, then boiled again in water to extract its sweetness. When the liquid cooled, it was left to ferment naturally for a day or two, enough for bubbles to form and flavor to develop. The result was cloudy, mildly sour, and full of nutrients, a kind of liquid bread. It was safer than water because the boiling killed much of what was harmful, and the fermentation kept it from spoiling quickly. Children drank it. Farmers carried it to the fields, and travelers filled their flasks with it. It gave energy, quenched thirst, and lasted for days. In many households, it was made in small batches almost every week, each family adjusting the taste according to what they had. Sometimes sweeter, sometimes bitter, sometimes flavored with herbs for variety, for those who lived near forests or hills. Another drink appeared, mead, made from honey and water. It was rarer, for honey was precious, but it had a long history. The honey was mixed with water and left to ferment, producing a golden, slightly sweet liquid. It was more expensive and far stronger than the daily ale, reserved for gatherings, feasts, and special occasions. But ordinary people rarely had the luxury of honey or fine ingredients. Their world was one of necessity. They learned to make drinks from what the land offered, fermented milk in colder regions, herbal infusions where clean springs could be found. Herbs like mint, sage, or elderflower were steeped in hot water, not for flavor alone, but because boiling made the liquid safer. It was medicine as much as refreshment that in coastal towns, rainwater was collected from rooftops into barrels, prized for its purity. But even this could turn quickly if not used soon. Every drop was precious, and every method of keeping it safe required knowledge passed quietly through generations. The monasteries, as in many things, led the way in refinement. Monks, skilled in observation and patience, perfected the craft of brewing. Their ale was cleaner, more consistent, and slightly stronger than what villagers made. It sustained them during fasting, when solid food was limited, and it became a source of income for abbeys that sold barrels to nearby towns. Their records, written in careful Latin, describe each stage: the soaking of grain, the boiling of the mash, the cooling, the waiting. They did not yet know why it worked, only that it did. For the common people, brewing was not science, it was survival. In homes of wattle and thatch, the smell of boiling grain filled the air. The pot was blackened from years of use. The liquid stirred with wooden paddles as children watched. When it was ready, it was poured through cloth into jars or barrels, the residue left for animals to eat. Every household had its own flavor, its own method. In this small way, even the poorest could take pride in something made by their own hands. Travelers on the road carried flasks or small kegs, knowing that water along the way could not be trusted. In served weak ale or warmed milk, depending on the region. In colder lands, people learned to heat their drink with herbs or oats, turning it into a thin porridge that filled and warmed at once. For those who worked the fields from dawn to dusk, this drink was more than refreshment. It was fuel. Still, there were moments when even the safest drinks could turn foul. Fermentation failed, barrels leaked, or mold grew. When that happened, people returned, cautiously, to water. They drew from springs high in the hills or melted snow from the mountains. Such water was prized, almost holy in its purity. In villages blessed with clear running springs, people gave them names, marked them with stones, and guarded them with care. The spring became not only a source of life, but a center of community in wealthier households. A variety of drinks appeared, though still simple by modern standards. Fruit juices from apples or berries were boiled and preserved. In some regions, especially in the warmer south, people pressed grapes for a light, sour drink that could last a few weeks. These were not luxurious wines, but rustic, homemade products, cloudy and thick, made more for sustenance than pleasure. What people drank in the Dark Ages reflected their world, practical, local, shaped entirely by necessity. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was made without purpose. To drink safely was an achievement, one earned by generations of careful observation that in many places, water still carried fear. It was needed for washing, cooking, and life itself, but few trusted it completely. Even the animals sometimes refused to drink from certain wells, and their instincts were heeded. When people did use water directly, they boiled it or mixed it with other ingredients. In the simplest homes, children learned early that clear did not always mean clean. Over time, habits formed that would last for centuries. Drinking became social as well as practical. At mealtimes, a jug of ale sat at the center of the table, passed from hand to hand. Travelers were offered a cup as a sign of welcome. Laborers shared it during rest. It was not about intoxication. Most of these drinks were weak and nourishing, but about safety, companionship, and routine. Even monasteries and hospitals brewed their own supplies, ensuring a steady source of clean liquid. The monks wrote of their processes in calm, detailed records, the best season for brewing, the temperature of the grain, the timing of fermentation. They saw it as part of their duty, to care for the body as well as the spirit, When we think of those times now, it's easy to imagine only hardship. But in truth, there was also a kind of quiet ingenuity. Without knowledge of microbes or chemistry, people still built systems of safety and taste that worked. Through trial and error, they created methods that balanced health, storage, and flavor. What began as a way to survive became a way to live. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the sky turned dark, the same simple scene played out across the land. Families gathered around the fire, bowls of coarse bread in hand. A jug beside them filled with that cloudy, homemade brew. The drink was cool, faintly sour, alive with the taste of grain and patience. It was not luxury, but it was comfort, a reminder that even in difficult times, people always found ways to make life bearable. When we think of what people drank when clean water was rare, it is not a story of deprivation, but of resilience. It is the story of those who turned necessity into habit, who learned to tame water through fire and time, and who left behind a legacy that still survives in every simple drink we share today. When we think of food in the early medieval world, we often picture bread, grain, and meat, the basic pillars of survival. Yet between the fields and the forests, in quiet corners of gardens and hedgerows, there grew another world of nourishment, the forgotten fruits, roots, and greens that sustained the people of the Dark Ages in ways far more subtle than we might imagine. These were the foods that rarely found their way into written record, but they filled bowls and bellies all the same. To live in those centuries meant living close to the land. Every household, no matter how poor, tended a small patch of soil if they could. Even the simplest garden was a collection of life: herbs, leafy greens, turnips, leeks, and whatever else the seasons allowed. What we might call wild food today was, to them, simply food. They gathered what nature offered and trusted their senses to know what was safe. Roots were the foundation of these diets. Before the arrival of the potato, people relied on hardier vegetables that could survive poor soil and cold winters. Turnips were among the most common, pale, knotted, and firm. They grew in abundance across Europe. Cooked over open fire or boiled in simple broth, they became soft, sweet, and filling. In poorer homes, turnips often took the place of meat, forming the bulk of stews and pottages. They were easy to store, too, piled in cool cellars or buried in straw to last through the cold months. Alongside turnips came parsnips and carrots, though not the bright orange kind we know today. Early medieval carrots were pale yellow or even purple, their flavor earthy and less sweet. They were grown both in gardens and in the wild, valued as much for their leaves as their roots. Parsnips were loved for their richness, a soft, nutty taste that made them ideal for soups and mash. These humble vegetables filled the gaps when grain harvests failed or hunting was scarce. Leeks and onions were constant companions of the medieval cook. They appeared in nearly every recipe that survived the age. The leek, in particular, was a favorite across northern Europe, hardy, easy to grow, and available almost year-round. Its flavor was gentle, its texture soft, and it added warmth to the simplest meal. Onion varieties were stronger, their scent clinging to hands and air alike, but their use was universal. They were boiled, roasted, and even eaten raw with coarse bread and cheese. Garlic, too, had its place, not as seasoning in the modern sense, but as a healer's ingredient, believed to strengthen the body and ward off illness. Then there were the greens, cabbages, spinach-like plants, and herbs that grew wherever people allowed them. Cabbage was not yet the tightly packed vegetable we know today. It was loose-leaved and wild, closer to kale. It grew in cool climates, its taste bitter but hearty. People boiled it to soften the flavor, often with a bit of salt or a piece of dried fish for richness. Nettles, yes, the same stinging plants we avoid today, were also cooked and eaten like spinach. Boiled, their sting disappeared, and they became a nutritious green, one of the first available after winter. In hungry months, Nettles could mean the difference between emptiness and a meal. For fruit, people depended on what the seasons allowed. Apples were the most familiar, small, tart, and often irregular in shape. The sweet, crisp varieties we take for granted did not exist yet. Most apples were better for cooking than eating raw. They were sliced, stewed, or baked into dense breads. In autumn, surplus apples were dried or pressed into juice, stored in barrels to ferment naturally. Pears grew in much the same way, hardy, firm, and slightly gritty. They were often boiled before being eaten. Berries filled the summer months with color and sweetness. Blackberries, raspberries, and elderberries grew wild along hedgerows, and gathering them was as much a part of daily life as tending the garden. They were eaten fresh, crushed into simple pastes, or mixed with honey to make sweet sauces. In colder months, dried berries added flavor to porridge or were brewed into thin, tart drinks. For many children, the first taste of sweetness came not from sugar, which was rare and costly, but from berries gathered by hand on long, quiet days. Plums and damsons, where they grew, were treasured. They could be eaten fresh, but more often they were dried in ovens or hung above the hearth to preserve them. Their deep, rich taste found its way into stews, giving a subtle sweetness to the savory dishes of the time. In the absence of refined sugar, fruit was the natural way to soften the harshness of salted or smoked foods. Nuts, too, played a part. Hazel trees were common across much of Europe, and their nuts were gathered in baskets each autumn. Crushed, they thickened soups and gave body to bread. Walnuts, rarer and more prized, were used sparingly. Even acorns, when properly soaked to remove their bitterness, could be ground into meal. Nothing edible was overlooked. Nothing that could sustain life was considered too humble in wealthier households. The variety grew wider. Gardens behind stone walls produced herbs and greens year-round: parsley, fennel, sage, and mint. These were used to flavor food, freshen breath, and ease digestion. Lettuce and endive appeared on the tables of monasteries, though only in spring, when the first leaves sprouted. In places with warmer climates, olives and figs were imported, dried, and traded like treasure. But for most people, such luxuries were unknown. Their plates were filled with what the soil beneath their feet could offer. Cooking was simple, practical, and slow. Vegetables were boiled in one pot with whatever else could be found: a piece of meat if available, or beans, or grains. This thick, nourishing mixture was called pottage, and it was the foundation of nearly every meal. Into it went turnips, onions, cabbage, and leeks, the everyday harvest of medieval life. Flavor came from herbs, salt, or occasionally a drop of oil or fat saved from previous cooking. The rhythm of eating followed the rhythm of growing. Spring was the time of greens and young shoots, nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic. Summer brought fruit and berries, autumn the roots and nuts, and winter the stored and dried. There was no abundance without labor, and no meal without memory of the season that gave it in remote villages. Gathering wild plants was an art passed down quietly from mother to daughter, father to son. People knew which roots could be eaten, which leaves healed, and which to avoid. Dandelion leaves, chickweed, and plantain were all familiar. In times of famine, even bark and moss found their way into cooking pots. It was not ideal, but it was survival, and survival, to them, was enough. The taste of medieval food was different from ours. It was stronger in some ways, simpler in others. It spoke of smoke, earth, and patience. Every ingredient was a product of place: the turnip from the northern field, the apple from the wild tree near the stream, the handful of herbs from the garden by the door. It was not cuisine as we know it, but a relationship between people and their land. When travelers came through a village, they could often guess the season by the smell from the hearths. In summer, the air was sweet with berries and fruit. In autumn, earthy and rich from roots and nuts. In winter, heavy with the scent of preserved cabbage and onions. Each meal told time in its own way. Monasteries again stood apart in their care for growing. Monks kept detailed gardens filled with medicinal and edible plants, carefully labeled and tended. Their records mention dozens of herbs and greens, some for flavor, some for healing. They ate modestly, but well, and their knowledge spread quietly to nearby villages. A single monk with a gift for gardening could influence how an entire community ate. Despite hardship, there was beauty in such self-sufficiency. People ate what they had grown, gathered, or traded. Nothing more, nothing less. The smallest patch of land could feed a family if tended wisely. Waste was rare and gratitude common. Each root pulled from the earth was seen not as abundance, but as continuation. When the long winters came and the earth froze, the memory of those gardens lived in storage pits and clay jars. Dried herbs hung from beams, roots lay buried in sand or straw, and barrels of preserved fruit lined the walls. Even then, when the world seemed asleep, the promise of green life remained tucked away, waiting for spring. It is easy, from the comfort of the present, to see the food of the dark ages as plain. Yet, in that simplicity lay wisdom. The people of that time knew their land intimately. They trusted its cycles, learned its limits, and survived by its gifts. Their forgotten foods, the roots and greens, the berries and herbs, were the quiet foundation of their endurance. When we think of medieval meals, we should not imagine only bread and broth. We should see the garden behind the cottage, the basket of wild greens carried home at dusk, the slow bubbling of the pot over the fire. We should remember that before the age of spices and trade, people lived not by luxury, but by knowing how to find nourishment in the humblest of things, and in that knowledge, patient, practical, and deeply human, they found enough. In the quiet world of the early Middle Ages, meat was not the centerpiece of every meal. It was a privilege. For the ordinary family, it was rare, a taste remembered more often than experienced. When people did eat meat, it was a mark of good fortune, a reminder of abundance in a life that rarely offered it. In times of hardship, even the scent of roasting fat drifting through the air could stir a sense of longing. The landscape of early medieval Europe was not one of endless fields filled with livestock. Animals were valuable for labor, for milk, for wool, not simply for food. To slaughter one meant losing a resource that could work, produce, or reproduce. And so, animals were kept alive as long as possible. A cow gave milk, a sheep gave wool, a chicken laid eggs. Only when age or sickness made them unfit for work did they become part of the table. For peasants, meat was a matter of circumstance, a gift of the season, a product of necessity. A pig or cow might be shared among several families, each receiving a portion salted or smoked for preservation. Game animals such as deer, boar, or hare belonged to the forests, but those forests were often the property of nobles. To hunt there without permission was to risk harsh punishment. The law protected the lord's game more fiercely than his land. For common folk, the forest was both a temptation and a boundary. Still, the people found ways. Rabbits, birds, and small animals caught in traps or nets often found their way into peasant pots. Hunting was done quietly, with snares and patience rather than bows. In some places, hedgehogs, badgers, and even squirrels were eaten, though rarely and only when times demanded. Nothing was wasted and nothing taken lightly. The meat, once caught, was cleaned carefully, roasted when fresh, or boiled into stews that could stretch a small portion across several meals. Preservation was an art of survival. Salt was precious, but where it was available, it was the key to storing meat through the winter. In coastal areas, people built salt pans and traded the crystals inland. Meat rubbed with salt would last weeks. When dried or smoked, it could last months. The process filled the air with a rich, sharp scent, wood smoke, brine, and fat. Smoked meats hung from rafters, darkened by years of fire. They were sliced thin, cooked again, and eaten with bread or boiled grains. Fish, however, was a more common source of protein. Rivers, lakes, and coasts were lifelines for entire communities. Fishing required patience rather than land, and for that reason, it was accessible to the poor. Nets woven by hand, baskets lowered into streams, and simple hooks made from bone or metal provided a steady supply of small catches: trout, eels, pike, and perch in fresh water. Herring, cod, and mackerel by the sea. The taste of fish was the taste of distance. Coastal villages lived by it, while inland towns relied on trade to bring it. Salted or dried fish became one of the most important commodities of the age. Barrels of preserved herring and cod traveled along muddy roads to monasteries and markets, their value measured almost like coin. For many, fish was more than just food. It was a rhythm of the week. Certain days were set aside for fasting, when meat was not eaten. On those days, fish filled the gap. It could be fresh, salted, or even pickled in vinegar and herbs. In regions with fast-flowing rivers, weirs and traps were built to catch them in large numbers. Villages near lakes often shared ownership of fishing rights, each family taking turns to cast their nets. The preparation of fish was simple but skillful. Fresh fish were cleaned immediately, gutted, and either boiled or roasted over open flame. In some places, they were wrapped in leaves and cooked in embers. Dried fish were soaked in water overnight before being added to stews or ground into flakes. The smell was strong, but so was the satisfaction it brought, a rich, salty taste that carried the essence of the sea. Those living far from the coast had to rely on preserved fish, which could be tough and fibrous. To soften it, cooks boiled it slowly with leeks or onions, letting the flavors blend. For poorer families, a small piece of fish might flavor an entire pot of soup. It was not waste, it was resourcefulness. Among the wealthier classes, meat was a mark of prestige. In great halls, feasts displayed abundance. Roasted joints of venison, boar, and goose. Birds decorated with herbs. Platters of fish served whole, heads and tails intact. Yet even there, luxury depended on preservation. Salt, smoke, and spice made it possible to serve food out of season, to impress guests with dishes that ordinary people never saw. The scent of roasted meat in such halls carried more than flavor. It carried power. But for the majority, meat remained rare and precious. Chickens were the most common livestock to end up on the table. They were small, easy to keep, and provided both eggs and occasional meat. Their flavor varied with their age and diet. Tough birds became broth. Young ones, roasted for special days. Geese were larger and often shared by several households. Their fat saved and used for cooking long after the feast ended. In colder regions, sheep and goats were valued for milk and wool first, meat last. Their bones, after boiling, were used to flavor soups and stews. Even marrow was scraped and eaten. Nothing edible was ever discarded. When a family slaughtered an animal, neighbors came to help, and each received a share, a kind of unspoken social contract that turned survival into community. In fishing towns, the same cooperation existed. Nets were mended together, boats launched together, catches divided fairly. On days of plenty, smokehouses filled with drying fish. On lean days, soup was stretched with grains or roots. The sea gave unpredictably, and those who lived by it learned humility, the smell of drying fish, the hiss of fat dripping onto fire, the creak of wooden boats returning at dawn. These were the sounds and scents of sustenance. The sea and rivers provided not luxury, but endurance. Monasteries again served as centers of discipline and skill. Their diets excluded meat on many days, but they developed rich traditions of fish preparation. In monastery ponds, carp and eels were raised for the table. Monks built systems of canals and water gates to control their flow. ensuring a steady supply even through winter. In detailed records, they described their catch, how the fish were kept, salted, and served. To them, it was not indulgence, but stewardship. Meanwhile, the peasant's pot told a different story, smaller, rougher, but no less meaningful. Inside, a few pieces of meat or fish simmered for hours with vegetables, thickening the broth until every drop carried flavor. Bread was dipped into it, absorbing the essence of the meal. The meat itself was eaten last, cut into thin slices to be shared evenly. A single portion could feed a family if prepared with care. Festivals were the rare moments when everyone, rich and poor alike, ate meat freely. A slaughtered animal meant not just food, but celebration. The smell of roasting filled the village square, the fire crackled, and laughter replaced the usual quiet. It was a time to remember that life, however hard, still had room for joy. But those moments were exceptions. On most days, the taste of meat or fish was faint, present more in memory than on the tongue. People learned to find flavor in herbs, in onions, in slow cooking. Hunger made simple things precious, and patience turned necessity into art to be why the later Middle Ages. Preservation had improved. Salt became more available, trade routes grew, and towns developed butchers' guilds. Yet, in the earlier centuries, food remained deeply tied to the rhythm of the land and water. To eat was to wait, to plan, to respect what the season offered. If you could step back into a medieval kitchen, you would find it small, smoky, and warm. A pot hanging over the hearth, a wooden table dusted with flour, a few onions, a handful of herbs, and a sliver of meat. Nothing wasted, everything used. The smell would be simple but full, a blend of smoke, salt, and slow effort. Meat and fish were never everyday luxuries. They were moments of reward, symbols of good fortune, and proof that survival had, at least for that day, succeeded. In that simplicity lies the real story of medieval food, not of feasts and extravagance, but of endurance. The people of the Dark Ages lived by what the land and water gave, and they understood something we often forget, that food is not just about plenty, but about balance, between hunger and satisfaction, between patience and gratitude. Every meal, no matter how small, carried that lesson. A bowl of fish broth, a slice of salted meat, a stew shared among neighbors. These were not just dishes, but reminders that survival itself was an achievement. And when the evening came, when fires dimmed and families gathered quietly around the hearth, the scent of the day's cooking lingered in the air, a faint mix of wood smoke, salt, and warmth. It was not abundance, but it was enough. Long before the hum of electric refrigerators and the easy reach of grocery stores, people lived in a world where food was a daily negotiation with time. In the early medieval centuries, nothing stayed fresh for long. The sun, the air, the seasons themselves decided how long a meal could last. And so, people learned to fight decay with patience, creativity, and the slow mastery of preservation. Every household, from the humblest peasant hut to the largest manor kitchen, understood that food could not be wasted. The harvest season was a race against rot. The summer's warmth filled baskets with abundance, but that same heat threatened to ruin what could not be eaten immediately. Without preservation, the winter months meant hunger. With it, they meant survival. The first rule of preservation was simple: use everything. The second was prepare early. As soon as crops came in or animals were slaughtered, the process began. The methods varied: salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, pickling, but the purpose was always the same: to make food last without losing too much of its nourishment. Salt was one of the most precious substances of the Middle Ages. It was more than flavor, it was life insurance. In places where it could be mined or produced from seawater, it became a source of wealth and trade. People knew that meat rubbed in salt, layered in barrels, or soaked in brine could last for months. Salt drew out moisture, the invisible invitation to decay, leaving behind something tough, dry, but safe to eat. That a single barrel of salted fish could feed a family through the hardest winter. Villages near the coast traded these barrels inland, where fresh catches were impossible to find. Salted cod and herring traveled across kingdoms, their value sometimes rivaling grain itself. Even the poorest homes saved what little salt they could, collected from trade, gifted from merchants, or scraped from the edges of boiling pans after seawater had evaporated. Where salt was scarce, smoke became the next guardian. Smoking food was both preservation and ritual. The hearth, always burning at the center of the home, became the natural tool. Hooks hung from the rafters, and strips of meat or fish were suspended above the rising smoke. Slowly, over days or weeks, the food darkened and dried, absorbing the scent of the wood, oak, beech, or alder, depending on the region. In that dim air, life and survival intertwined. The smokehouse, whether a separate shed or the space above a kitchen fire, smelled of warmth and labor. Smoke curled lazily around hams, sausages, and fish, seeping into every pore. It hardened the outside, sealed the inside, and made each piece last through the cold months ahead. When winter came, those same pieces were soaked or boiled, the smoke. Flavor lingering like memory, sharp, comforting, unmistakable. Drying, too, was common, nature's simplest and oldest preservation. Fruits, herbs, and strips of meat were laid on racks in the open air or under gentle heat. In summer, the wind did the work. In colder seasons, the warmth of the hearth finished it. Dried apples, plums, and berries were stored in cloth sacks or earthen jars. They lost their softness, but not their sweetness. A handful of dried fruit could brighten a winter porridge or sweeten bread long after the orchards were bare. For grains and legumes, preservation meant protection from moisture and pests. After harvest, they were dried thoroughly, then stored in large wooden chests or clay pots sealed with wax or cloth. Some families built raised granaries, small wooden huts lifted off the ground to keep out rodents. Every handful of grain represented hours of labor, and so the guarding of it was almost sacred. When supplies ran low, families measured carefully, counting the days until the next harvest. Fermentation, though few understood its science, was one of the most remarkable tools of survival. People discovered, through observation and repetition, that certain foods could be transformed by time rather than ruined by it. Cabbage, for instance, became softer and tangy when layered with salt and left in a cool place. The result was both preserved and enriched, full of flavor and easier to digest. In regions where vegetables were scarce in winter, this sour, fermented cabbage, a simple form of what we now know as sauerkraut, provided vital nutrition. Cheese was another triumph of fermentation. Milk soured quickly, but with care, it could be coaxed into a lasting form. In cottages and monasteries alike, curds were pressed into molds, salted, and left to age. Hard cheeses kept for months, even years, their flavor growing stronger with time. They were dense, heavy, and built for endurance, made to withstand long journeys or cold seasons. Soft cheeses were eaten fresh, but even they stretched the life of milk just a little longer. Butter, too, could be preserved by turning it into a clarified form, melting away the impurities and storing the golden fat in sealed pots. In colder climates, it hardened naturally, lasting through the year. Elsewhere, people mixed butter with salt or herbs to keep it stable. Every spoonful of fat meant warmth and strength, calories stored in solid form. Pickling offered another layer of protection. Vinegar, brine, or even sour ale became tools for extending life. Vegetables like onions, cucumbers, and turnips were submerged in these liquids and sealed. Over time, they absorbed the tang, their texture changing but their usefulness extended. Pickled foods cut through the heaviness of winter meals and reminded people of summer's brightness when the world outside was cold and gray. The process of preserving food was rarely silent. In villages, autumn was the busiest time of year. Families worked together, cleaning, slicing, salting, hanging. Smoke drifted from chimneys, the air filled with the mingled smells of earth, wood, and brine. Children gathered herbs for drying, women packed jars, and men carried barrels into cellars. It was a communal act, a shared investment in survival. Underground storage was essential. Cellars, dug into cool earth, acted as natural refrigerators. The air inside stayed steady and damp, perfect for storing roots and cured meats. Barrels lined the walls, marked with charcoal symbols to show their contents: fish, apples, ale, or preserved vegetables. The floor was covered with straw, which absorbed moisture and softened footsteps. In some homes, the cellars were more carefully maintained than the rooms above. They were, after all, the true heart of survival. Ice and snow, where available, were also tools of preservation, though less common. In northern regions, people stored blocks of ice from frozen lakes, packed in sawdust or straw to cool perishable foods. It was primitive refrigeration, and only wealthier estates could manage it. For most, the earth itself remained the most reliable keeper. Not everything could be preserved. Fresh greens, milk, and soft fruits disappeared quickly once their time passed. Their loss was accepted as part of the rhythm of life. The skill was not in having everything all the time, but in having enough when nothing grew. The knowledge of preservation was inherited, passed quietly through families, tested by experience. A small mistake, too much moisture, too little salt, the wrong kind of wood, could ruin weeks of work. Monasteries again stood at the center of innovation. Their records describe methods for curing, brining, fermenting, and storing with an accuracy few households could match. They built separate smokehouses, cool rooms, and storerooms designed to keep constant temperature. Their discipline and observation preserved not only food, but knowledge. For travelers, preserved food was as vital as the road itself. Soldiers carried dried meat and hard bread. Traders packed salted fish and cheese. These provisions were tough, unappetizing, but enduring. Each bite tasted of distance, a link between lands and seasons. Preserved food also shaped the rhythm of daily eating. Fresh produce was fleeting. Preserved goods filled the long gaps between harvests. The winter diet, heavy with smoked meat, pickled vegetables, and dried fruit, reflected both necessity and resourcefulness. It was not variety that mattered, but endurance. The act of preservation was as much about patience as skill. It demanded time, attention, and respect for nature's pace. A loaf of bread lasted days, but a jar of dried apples could last months. A well-salted ham might feed a family all winter. These acts, repeated year after year, became part of the culture, not innovation, but inheritance. In the quiet of the evening, after the work was done, the smoke still curled upward from chimneys, carrying with it the faint scent of hickory or oak. Inside, people rested, knowing their shelves were lined, their barrels sealed, their jars cool and steady in the cellar. It was a kind of peace, not born of plenty, but of preparedness. Food preservation, in those centuries, was not only about storing calories. It was about trust in one's own hands, in the turning of the seasons, in the knowledge passed down through generations. It was a quiet mastery of nature, learned not in books but in daily repetition. And as the cold winds returned, and the earth froze once more, those who had planned well faced the dark months with calm. They had warmth, they had food, and they had time to rest, to repair, to wait. Their jars and barrels stood like promises in the stillness. That was the secret of survival before refrigeration. Not technology, but rhythm, the unbroken cycle of growth, harvest, and keeping. A cycle measured not in convenience, but in care. When we imagine kitchens today, we picture order, rows of utensils, polished metal, and steady light. But in the centuries of the early Middle Ages, the kitchen was something far older, rougher, and alive with smoke and shadow. It was not a room defined by comfort, but by necessity, a place where stone, wood, and flame worked together to make life bearable through every season. The medieval kitchen, in most homes, was not even a separate room. It was wherever the fire was. In peasant cottages, that meant the single open space where the family lived, worked, and slept. The hearth stood at the center, a raised circle of stone or packed clay. Around it, tools were few but essential: an iron pot, a wooden spoon, a knife, and a ladle. Above it hung a blackened chain or an iron hook from which pots could be suspended at varying heights. There were no stoves, no ovens as we know them, only the steady, unpredictable heat of open flame. Fire was both friend and danger. It gave warmth, cooked food, and dried clothing, but it also filled the air with smoke that stung the eyes and darkened the walls. Roofs were often open at the top or fitted with small vents to let the smoke drift upward, though the air inside remained hazy. In winter, that haze was a comfort, proof that warmth still lingered. In summer, it was a trial endured for survival. Cooking over open fire required instinct. There were no thermometers, no measurements, no fixed recipes. The cook judged by sight, sound, and smell, by how the pot simmered, how the wood crackled, how the scent shifted from raw to ready. Every meal was a small act of experience repeated until it became second nature. Iron was precious, and not every household could afford it. Some cooked in clay pots, made thick and rough to withstand the heat. These pots sat directly in the coals, their curved sides collecting soot. Over time, they developed a black sheen that seasoned the clay and made it stronger. When one cracked, it was repaired with wire or patched with mud until it could no longer hold together. To lose a pot was to lose a tool of survival that in larger homes or manor estates. The kitchen stood apart from the main hall, a practical choice to keep smoke and heat away from living quarters. These kitchens were grander, though still primitive by modern eyes. Stone walls enclosed wide hearths large enough to hold several fires at once. Iron grates and tripods supported cauldrons big enough to feed dozens. Meat was roasted on long spits turned by hand or, in wealthier houses, by small mechanical devices powered by counterweights or even dogs walking in circular tread wheels. The constant rotation ensured even cooking, a luxury of precision in a world that had little of it. Tools were simple but cleverly made. The cooking knife was the most important, its shape broad and practical, used for everything from slicing bread to carving meat. Wooden spoons of various lengths stirred pots and scraped the sides of kettles. Mortars and pestles ground herbs and grains, their rhythmic tapping a familiar sound. Wooden bowls served as mixing vessels, and flat stones were used to knead or pound dough. Metal pans existed, but few owned them. Copper, bronze, and iron were expensive and often passed down through generations. A single iron pan could last a lifetime if cared for properly, wiped with oil, kept from rust, and never left empty on the flame. Water was carried by hand, in buckets of wood or clay, and poured into pots or troughs. There were no taps, no steady streams on command. Each drop was fetched from a well or stream, and so it was used carefully, for cooking, washing, and cleaning, always in that order. Lighting was limited to daylight and flame. In the early morning, the kitchen was pale and cold. By evening, it glowed gold and red. Shadows moved across the walls as the fire flickered, throwing shapes that made the small room seem alive. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the earthy scent of clay and the faint sweetness of whatever simmered in the pot. Bread, the heart of every meal, required its own tools. Many villages had a communal oven, a great stone chamber heated by firewood. Once the interior reached its peak temperature, the embers were swept out, and the loaves were slid inside on long wooden paddles. The oven's mouth glowed faintly, and the smell of baking filled the air. Families marked their loaves with small cuts or symbols before placing them in, ensuring that when the bread came out, each could claim their OWN to IN wealthier homes. Private ovens were built of stone and mortar, their domed roofs capturing heat efficiently. These ovens were multi-purpose, baking bread, roasting meat, even drying herbs and fruit. They were heated in the morning and often stayed warm throughout the day, their slow-cooling stones serving as the medieval equivalent of stored energy. Food preparation relied heavily on time and cooperation. Grinding grain, chopping vegetables, and tending fires required many hands. In large kitchens, servants worked in coordinated silence, each knowing their task. One turned the spit, another stirred the pot, a third chopped onions on a wooden block. The cook, usually an older, experienced figure, directed the rhythm, tasting, adjusting, commanding. In smaller homes, these same duties fell to one or two people, often the matron of the household, who balanced cooking with every other responsibility the day demanded. Storage was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, everything that could spoil did so quickly. Cool cellars held barrels of salted meat, jars of dried fruit, and sacks of grain. Herbs hung from beams, drying in slow air. Earthen pots sealed with wax or cloth kept insects away. In some regions, small pits were dug into the ground outside and lined with straw, used to store roots and vegetables through the winter. Every item had its place, and order was survival. The tools of cleaning were as important as those of cooking. Ashes from the hearth were mixed with water to make a primitive lye, a soft alkaline solution used to scrub pots and utensils. Sand served as an abrasive, scouring soot and grease from surfaces. Rags were woven from old cloth, and brushes were made from bundled twigs. It was not about sparkle, but about function, keeping the limited tools usable for as long as possible. Smells were constant companions. Smoke clung to clothing, the scent of fat lingered in hair, and the wooden walls absorbed the aroma of meals long past. Yet, to those who lived there, these smells meant comfort, signs of warmth, of food, of continuity. The kitchen was not clean in the modern sense, but it was cared for, tended daily with quiet diligence that in monasteries. The kitchens were larger still, designed to feed entire communities of monks. Their orderliness reflected their discipline. Long tables for chopping and grinding, great stone sinks for washing, and a steady supply of water from nearby streams made their kitchens advanced for their time. Records show they used separate areas for baking, brewing, and preserving, their knowledge spreading slowly into the surrounding villages. The tools they used were crafted locally, often by blacksmiths who understood the needs of cooks. Iron hooks, tongs, and pokers were made to withstand constant heat. Wooden spoons and ladles were carved from beech or oak, sturdy and heat-resistant. Clay pots, produced by village potters, varied in shape, some narrow for boiling, others wide for stewing. Every tool bore the mark of human hands. Every surface, a history of use. Even with such simplicity, the act of cooking demanded attention. The fire could not be left alone. Too hot, and food burned. Too low, and the meal remained raw. The cook judged the flame by color, deep red for baking, orange for boiling, white for searing. A well-managed fire was as important as the ingredients themselves. Children learned early to respect the hearth. It was both warmth and danger, generosity and punishment. The stories told by the fire at night were as much about safety as about wonder. To lose control of the fire was to risk everything: home, harvest, and life. Despite the hardship, there was comfort in the routine. The morning began with kindling, the careful stacking of wood, the spark of flint. Then came the slow stirring of ashes, the hiss as the first pot met the heat, and the rising scent of food. By midday, The kitchen was alive, filled with sound, motion, and purpose. By nightfall, it quieted again, the last embers glowing faintly in the dark eye in the kitchens of great halls. Life followed the same rhythm on a grander scale. Dozens of fires burned at once, roasting whole animals or boiling massive pots of stew. The sound of chopping, scraping, and crackling filled the air. Soot clung to beams, and the floor was always warm beneath the feet. There was chaos, but also order, a human rhythm honed over centuries. Tools evolved slowly. The basic form of the cauldron, the pot, the knife, all remained nearly unchanged for hundreds of years. Progress came not through invention, but through mastery of material. The iron grew stronger, the clay finer, the handles sturdier. But the essence of cooking stayed constant, to transform the raw into the nourishing, the perishable into the sustaining in the quiet of evening. When the last dishes were washed and the fires were banked low, the medieval kitchen returned to stillness. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the smell of wood and warmth lingered. Outside, the night pressed close, cold and vast, but inside, there was light, and with it, life. Those smoky rooms, with their soot-blackened walls and simple tools, were the heart of medieval survival. Every meal, from the poorest pot of pottage to the grandest roasted feast, passed through hands that understood fire, time, and patience. And those centuries have passed, the rhythm remains. When we think of the food of the early Middle Ages, we often imagine it as bland, heavy bread, boiled grains, stews with little flavor. But that picture misses something essential. While their ingredients were simple, medieval people cared deeply about taste. They lived close to the land, knew every plant and root around them, and discovered how to draw flavor from what little they had. In a time when spices from distant lands were luxuries only nobles could afford, the ordinary cook turned to gardens, forests, and fields for ways to bring life to their daily meals. Salt was the first and most powerful seasoning, and its importance went far beyond preservation. It was the foundation of taste. A pinch of salt could transform a dull stew into something hearty and comforting. In a world without refrigeration, salt's role in keeping food safe also meant that nearly every dish carried its distinct, sharp note. Villages near the sea used salt made from evaporated seawater, while inland communities mined it from earth and stone, trading it like treasure. To run out of salt was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Salt meant survival. Next came herbs, the quiet, ever-present soul of medieval flavor. Every cottage garden held a few hardy plants that could grow even in poor soil: parsley, sage, thyme, and dill. These herbs were used fresh in summer and dried in bunches to last through the winter. They gave food depth, brightness, and balance. Parsley, with its clean, green taste, was sprinkled into almost every pot. Sage brought a deep, earthy warmth to fatty meats and stews. Thyme, with its small, fragrant leaves, was prized for its strength. A single sprig could send a whole meal. Garlic and onions were among the most common seasonings, found in nearly every kitchen. They added body to broths and strength to otherwise plain dishes. Crushed garlic was mixed with salt and herbs to create rustic pastes, spread on bread or stirred into hot porridge. Onions were boiled, roasted, or eaten raw, their sweetness emerging slowly through heat. They were the backbone of medieval cooking, simple, cheap, and transformative. Wherever people lived, they learned the flavors of their land. In the north, mustard seeds were ground into pastes, creating a sharp, biting condiment that paired well with cured meats or fish. The seeds were crushed using small mortars and mixed with vinegar or sour ale, forming an early version of mustard that was both spicy and long-lasting. In regions rich with wild plants, cooks gathered marjoram, lovage, and fennel, using leaves, seeds, and roots alike. These herbs flavored soups, vegetables, and sometimes even bread doughs, giving the simplest meal a touch of fragrance. Vinegar played a vital role in both taste and preservation. It came naturally from the slow souring of ale or wine and was used generously. A splash of vinegar lifted the heaviness of stews, preserved cooked vegetables, and brought brightness to dishes that otherwise leaned toward the earthy. People even mixed vinegar with herbs or honey to create what they called sharp sauces, simple yet effective ways to revive leftovers in households that could afford it. Honey was the universal sweetener. Sugar was rare and precious, known in some places, but far too costly for ordinary people. Honey filled that space beautifully. Its flavor depended on the flowers from which bees had gathered nectar, so every region produced its own distinct taste. Thick, golden honey was stirred into porridge, spread on bread, or mixed with vinegar for sweet and sour sauces. When boiled and reduced, it became a glaze for roasted roots or fruits. The balance of sweet and sour, strong and mild, was central to medieval taste. People did not seek subtlety. They wanted warmth, depth, and satisfaction. Even the poorest cook understood how to create contrast. A pot of vegetables simmering over the fire might be lifted at the end with a handful of fresh herbs or a splash of sour broth saved from an earlier meal. The goal was always to make food nourishing, but also worth enjoying in the kitchens of the wealthy. Flavor was an art form and a display of status. Nobles imported exotic spices through long and dangerous trade routes: cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and ginger. These came from distant lands few Europeans had ever seen, carried by traders across deserts and seas. The cost was enormous, and so was their power as symbols of wealth. To season food with pepper or cinnamon was to show not only taste, but influence. For ordinary people, these spices were legends, their scent known only through rumor or rare glimpses in market stalls. But even without imported spice, the common people were no strangers to creativity. They understood fermentation, how to transform cabbage, grains, and milk into foods rich with tang and life. The sourness that came from this process wasn't just preservation. It was flavor. A fermented broth or stew carried complexity far beyond its ingredients. It was the taste of time itself that in forests and meadows. Wild herbs and roots offered additional variety. Wild garlic, mint, sorrel, and nettle added sharp or fresh notes to dishes. Sorrel, in particular, was loved for its tartness, a natural substitute for lemons, which were unknown in northern Europe. Nettles, once boiled, became tender and earthy, often cooked into pottage with onions or grains. Even dandelion leaves were gathered young and eaten as greens. Cooks also discovered that roasting changed flavor entirely. A vegetable or piece of meat cooked over open flame developed a sweetness, a faint smokiness that could not be achieved by boiling. The scent of roasting, a mix of wood, fat, and heat, filled every settlement with familiarity. When food was scarce, even the smell was a kind of comfort, a promise that something warm was waiting. In monasteries, where discipline shaped every part of life, cooking still allowed room for refinement. Monks grew herbs in carefully tended gardens, cataloged their properties, and used them to season the simple meals permitted by their rules. Their records mention mixtures of herbs used to flavor broth, fish, and bread, combinations that sound modern even today. Some abbeys became famous for their gardens, their herbs traded to nearby villages. The monks' quiet care for taste preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. For most, however, flavor was a matter of proximity, what could be gathered, dried, or stored nearby. In winter, when the landscape offered little, families turned to what they had saved: bunches of dried herbs hanging from beams, jars of vinegar infused with mint or sage, pots of honey thick with crystallized sweetness. A pinch here, a drop there, each used carefully, with the understanding that it must last until spring. The act of seasoning food was not only practical, It was cultural. People shared flavors across generations. A mother's handful of herbs, a father's method of salting, a grandparent's way of boiling, all became part of the family's rhythm. Each region developed its own flavor identity. Some leaned toward the sharp and sour, others toward mild sweetness. Even the smell of a home's cooking could tell outsiders where they were: the fennel and garlic of the south, the leeks and mustard of the north. When travelers stopped at inns or cottages, they often remembered the taste of a particular meal long after the road had faded from memory. A simple stew flavored with onions, parsley, and a hint of vinegar could linger in the mind like warmth itself. Flavor connected people not only to their food, but to their place, their soil, their air, their history. In a world of uncertainty, taste offered familiarity. The same herbs gathered in spring returned again each year, the same salt boiled down, the same honey taken from hives. Each season carried its palette of flavors, predictable yet always changing in small ways. Even hardship could not remove the comfort of something that tasted right at its heart. Medieval seasoning was not about luxury, but about knowledge of the land, of preservation, of patience. People knew how long to dry herbs before they lost their color, how much salt to add to avoid bitterness, how to store vinegar so it would not turn harsh. Their tools were few, but their understanding was deep. They did not need abundance. They needed awareness. And so, even in the poorest cottage, where the pot simmered with little more than water, vegetables, and grain, the meal was never truly plain. The cook added something: a sprig of thyme, a spoon of honey, a bit of vinegar, not to disguise simplicity, but to honor it. When night fell and families gathered by the hearth, their bowls steaming in the dim light, the first taste of that meal carried with it more than nourishment. It carried centuries of memory, the knowledge that even in times of scarcity, flavor could be found, and that comfort was not the gift of wealth, but of care. When we look back on the food of the Dark Ages, it seems distant: coarse bread, smoky rooms, and slow meals made with little. But behind every loaf, every pot of stew, every jar sealed for winter, there was quiet intelligence and care. The people who lived then understood something that modern abundance often hides: that food was not only sustenance, but a form of resilience. They worked with what they had: the grains they grew, the roots they pulled from the earth, the herbs they gathered from the forest's edge. They learned to preserve, to season, and to share. Every flavor they created, however small, carried the memory of labor and survival. Nothing was wasted. Everything had value. Life was harsh, but it was balanced by a deep respect for the land that sustained it. People cooked slowly, ate together, and measured time through the rhythm of the harvest. Food wasn't something to be taken for granted. It was proof that another day had been earned. Today, it's easy to forget how much effort a single meal once required. But if we listen closely to the past, we can still hear its quiet rhythm: the scrape of a knife against wood, the sound of a pot stirring, the smell of bread cooling near the fire. Each sound reminds us that even in the hardest centuries, people always found warmth in simple acts: growing, cooking, and sharing what they had. The forgotten foods of the Dark Ages may no longer fill our tables, but their story still lingers in every meal we make by hand, in every bite that reminds us of patience and gratitude. Thank you for joining this calm journey through history. If you'd like to return for more quiet stories from the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, sleep well, and may your night be as peaceful as the quiet kitchens of long ago.